A person does not ask certain questions out loud because they are afraid of the answer. What happens after death? This question has wandered through humanity in the same way for centuries, sometimes beside a grave, sometimes in the middle of the night when everyone else is asleep, and sometimes without any reason at all. Does a life truly end, or does it simply change its form? Humans like to circle around this question, but rarely dare to step inside it, because death, with its unknown nature, is one of the hardest realities for the human mind to accept. Death is not only an ending, it is also a void, and the human mind does not tolerate emptiness. That is why, throughout history, people have chosen not so much to search for answers, but to believe in them. Myths were born, legends were told. It was said that the soul moved from one body to another. In some cultures, this idea became hope. In others, it became a way to soften pain. For some societies, reincarnation was the natural continuation of life. For others, it was a branch to cling to when reality became unbearable. Science, for a long time, stayed outside this debate because science keeps its distance from what it cannot measure. It does not embrace what it cannot prove, and it rarely takes seriously any claim that cannot be repeated. For this reason, the idea of life after death was labeled unscientific for many years. Those who spoke about it were either ignored in academic circles or treated as objects of ridicule. Silence was the thickest cover placed over this question, until toward the end of the 20th century, certain voices began to disturb that silence. One of those voices belonged to an American psychiatrist. His name was Dr. Harold Whitman. Whitman devoted a large part of his professional life to studying children who claimed to have memories of previous lives. But his goal was not to prove anything. On the contrary, he preferred not knowing what he would encounter. What drew him to this subject was a recurring strangeness. The children, but not ordinary children. These children spoke about the past, not like telling a fairy tale, not like playing a game. They took no pleasure in what they described. They did not portray themselves as heroes. They did not embellish their stories. On the contrary, when the subject came up, they became uneasy. Some fell silent. Some cried. Some refused to speak at all, as if what they were describing did not belong to them, as if they were carrying a burden too heavy for a child's shoulders. Over the years, hundreds of case files crossed Whitman's desk. Most were closed quickly, but some, no matter how deeply they were examined, they refused to be easily explained. Those files were placed in a separate section of Whitman's archive, and one of them concerned an incident in Eastern Europe, near the city of Brașov, Romania. At the center of the case was a boy only 6 years old. His name was Mihai Popescu, and what he was about to say would bring this silent question back into the light once again. Science was never created to answer every question, but there are certain questions it cannot completely escape. The idea of life after death has always been an uncomfortable territory for science, because this question does not fit inside test tubes. It cannot be measured, repeated, or reproduced under the same conditions. For that reason, science chose, for many years, to circle around the question rather than confront it. It remained silent. It kept its distance. But for Dr. Harold Whitman, silence was no longer enough. In the early years of his career, Whitman was a conventional psychiatrist. He worked with trauma. He studied children's fears, repressed memories, and imaginative worlds. For him, every narrative had a psychological explanation, until certain case files began to fall outside those explanations. These files shared something in common. The children were very young. Most were between 4 and 7 years old. And what they described did not align with their own lives. What was even stranger was this. Most of these children were not eager to speak. If this had been pure imagination, the children would have enjoyed it. They would have embellished their stories, sought attention, added new details. But the children Whitman encountered did the opposite. They did not want to talk. There was no joy in their accounts. In some cases, there was clear discomfort. At first, Whitman thought this was a form of trauma projection, a subconscious construction, false memories, family influence. But as the number of cases grew, certain things began to repeat. The same words, the same descriptions, the same silences, and most importantly, the same consistency. A child would describe the same event weeks later, in the same sequence, with the same details, nothing added, nothing removed. This was not a familiar pattern in psychiatry. At this point, Whitman set a boundary for himself, a boundary that would define his method. Children would never be asked leading questions. Did you see this? Did you experience that? Did someone tell you this? Questions like these were strictly forbidden. Whitman's method was simple but rigid. Listen, remain silent, allow space. Because sometimes a child speaks only when no one expects them to. Over the years, Whitman noticed something else. These narratives lasted only up to a certain age. Then, they slowly faded away. As if a window opened, stayed open for a short while, and then closed on its own. And once that window closed, all that remained was something that had been spoken. There was no proof, no certainty, but there was a repetition that could not be ignored. For Whitman, that repetition marked the point where science came to a halt. And that is precisely why the file from Eastern Europe, the report from near Brasov, Romania, was different from the others. Because this time, the one asking the question was not only a scientist. This time, a family was facing the same question as well. And that question did not yet have a name. But even unnamed, everyone could feel it. From the outside, Mihai Popescu's life appeared ordinary. Excessively so. In the small town near Brasov, mornings always began the same way, with cold air that lightly stung the face. The streets were quiet in the early hours, only the distant sound of a bus, or sometimes the crunch of gravel beneath shoes. Mihai was a child who struggled to wake up in the mornings. When his mother entered his room, he would pull the blanket over his head. When he finally woke, the first thing he did was not to speak, but to look around, as if he needed to make sure the room was still there. The house was small but orderly, family photographs on the walls, a radio always standing in the same corner of the kitchen. It was usually on, but no one really listened. It was there simply to fill the silence. Mihai, like most children his age, enjoyed playing outside. On muddy days, he dirtied his shoes without concern, ignoring his mother's warnings. He lined up his toy cars and stared at them for long stretches of time. But unlike other children, Mihai did not talk much while he played. He did not narrate stories to himself. He did not give his cars names. He played quietly. In preschool, his teachers described him as well-adjusted. He followed the rules, did not fight, did not draw attention. But sometimes in the middle of a lesson, he would drift away. In those moments, his eyes would fix on a single point in the room. When asked, he would say, "I was thinking about something." What he was thinking about, he never explained. Similar moments happened at home as well. At dinner, he would sometimes hold his fork and pause before taking the first bite, as if he were waiting for something that was not at the table. His mother attributed it to fatigue, his father to the absent-mindedness of a growing child. No one considered any other possibility, because there was nothing to be afraid of. Not yet. At night, Mihai usually slept deeply, but on some nights his sleep became light. When his mother got up to fetch a glass of water, she would hear small sounds coming from Mihai's room. A turning motion, the creak of the bed. When she opened the door, she would find Mihai awake. But he was not crying. He was not calling out. He was simply looking. When asked, "Did something happen?" he would shake his head. No. That no always felt incomplete, but no one noticed its absence yet, because in those days, Mihai was still a child, an ordinary child, and life had not yet placed different words on his tongue. Not yet. The first rupture did not arrive with a scream. There was no crisis, no panic. It was quieter. And because of that, it took time to notice. One afternoon, Mihai was playing in the living room. His toy cars were lined up on the floor, as always without speaking, as always with careful attention. His mother was in the kitchen. Steam was rising from a pot, filling the room. The window was slightly open. Cold air carried by the wind slipped inside from time to time. Everything was ordinary, until Mihai slowly placed the car in his hand onto the floor. Then he stood up. The game was unfinished, but it did not seem to bother him. He left the living room and walked to the window. He stood there looking outside for a moment, but what he was looking at was not the street. When his mother approached from behind, Mihai spoke without turning around. "How did I get here?" The sentence was not spoken loudly. It was not emphasized. It sounded like a casual exchange of information. At first, his mother did not understand what he meant. She smiled. "What do you mean by that?" she asked. Mihai shrugged. "I don't know," he said. "Just like that." The answer seemed to close the conversation. His mother did not dwell on it, because children sometimes say things like that. But after that day, small changes began to appear in Mihai. His games became shorter. Sometimes while playing, he would suddenly stop and tilt his head, as if listening to something. At other times, he would crouch down, rest his hands on his knees, and remain completely still for a while. When asked, he always gave the same answer. Nothing. But this nothing felt heavier than before. The first night, Mihai woke silently from his sleep. He did not cry. He did not shout. He simply sat up in his bed. When his mother came to him, she noticed his small body trembling slightly. The room was cool, but the trembling was not from the cold. "Did you have a dream?" she asked. Mihai did not shake his head, but he did not say no either. "There was noise," he said. "What kind of noise?" she asked. There was no answer. In the days that followed, these nights repeated, always in the same way. Silent awakenings, empty stares, short sentences. And one evening at the dinner table, another word finally escaped his mouth. No one had asked him anything. The radio was on. The news played softly in the background. Mihai placed his spoon on the table and, as if speaking not to the room, but to somewhere else, said, "It was very dark." Everyone at the table froze. "Where was that?" his father asked. Mihai did not answer. He thought for a moment. Then, in a very calm voice, he added, "I was there." That sentence was the moment the game ended, because a child does not describe an unknown place by calling it there. And from that evening on, nothing was ever the same again. Night makes everything more visible. Whatever is suppressed during the day rises to the surface in the dark. For Mihai, it was the same. His sleep was now fragmented. But this was not the awakening of a child from nightmares. There were no screams, no tears, only sudden alertness. Sometimes his mother would wake in the middle of the night and hear faint sounds coming from Mihai's room. The creak of the bed, a change in breathing. When she opened the door, she would find Mihai sitting upright in his bed, his eyes open, but his gaze fixed on emptiness. When she asked, "Are you okay?" Mihai often did not answer. Sometimes he only nodded, but his body was speaking. His hands clenched into fists. His jaw tightened slightly. His shoulders tensed, slumping forward as if carrying an invisible weight. One night, as his mother tried to straighten the blanket, Mihai suddenly flinched. "What happened to me?" he said. His voice was neither fearful nor harsh. It sounded like a reflex. His mother stepped back. In that moment, she understood this was not a conscious reaction. It was an unthinking response, a reply from the body itself. As days passed, these reactions began to surface during the daytime as well. While playing outside, if Mihai heard a sudden noise, he would freeze in place. A car door slamming shut, the sharp clang of metal. In those moments, he held his breath and pressed his hands against his sides. When asked, "Did something happen?" he would say, "It's over." But it wasn't. Some part of his body was still on alert. One evening, as his mother was preparing him for a bath, Mihai refused to let her wash his arm. "Does it hurt?" she asked. Mihai looked at his arm for a long time. "In the past," he said, "this part was injured." "When?" she asked. Mihai did not answer, but he pointed to a specific spot on his arm, a precise location, not random. His mother looked closely. There was no mark there. But on Mihai's face there was a strange calm, the calm of certainty. Meal times had changed as well. Mihai no longer began eating without first staring at his plate for a long moment. Sometimes after the first bite, he would stop, swallowing as if clearing his throat. When asked, "Is something wrong?" he would say, "It's difficult." Difficult how? The food? Swallowing? He never explained. But his mother noticed something. Mihai was regulating his breathing while eating, as if he needed to slow down. This was not learned behavior. This was instinct. One night was different from the others. After waking up, Mihai spoke for the first time. His mother sat at the edge of the bed. A dim light filled the room. Outside, the wind was blowing. Mihai spoke without closing his eyes. "We were running," he said. His mother did not ask anything. Mihai continued, "I couldn't catch my breath." As he said this, he placed his hand on his chest, not in panic, as if describing something. Then he fell silent. He said nothing else that night. But one thing was now clear. What Mihai was remembering was not coming from his mind. It was coming from his body. There are certain words that do not belong in a child's mouth. The moment they are spoken, the color of the room changes. Mihai's words were beginning to change. He was no longer speaking only about sensations, not just darkness, noise, or breath. The words were becoming more specific. One morning, as his mother was getting him ready for school, Mihai stopped while putting on his shoes. The laces remained in his hands. "Wet," he said. "What's wet?" his mother asked. Mihai answered without lifting his head. "The ground." This answer was unlike anything he had said before, because it wasn't a feeling, it was a condition. That afternoon, after returning from school, Mihai was sitting on the floor of his room. A few toys were placed in front of him, but this time the arrangement was not random. The toys were not side by side. They were lined up one after another, with space between them. As he looked at the formation, Mihai murmured, "That's how the line was." His mother stopped. "What line?" she asked. Mihai shrugged. "Our line." Those two words, "our line," were not a child's words. At dinner, conversation faded. The father was silent. The mother watched carefully. As Mihai was eating his soup, he paused. "The commander was angry," he said, "because we were slow." The spoons on the table froze. "Who?" his father asked. Mihai answered without hesitation. "The commander." The word landed with unusual clarity. This was not a fairy tale, not a game. It sounded like the description of a duty. Night returned, but this time when Mihai woke from sleep, his language woke with his body. One night he sat up, breathing hard, but he did not scream. "It was in my hand," he said. His mother rushed to his side. "What was?" she asked. Mihai opened his palms as if releasing something invisible. "It was heavy," he said. "I had to carry it." "What were you carrying?" The question escaped his mother's mouth before she could stop herself. Mihai did not look away as he answered. "A bullet." The word fell into the room like a cold object. Bullet. That word does not come from games. It is not learned from television. That word comes from experience. In the days that followed, more words appeared. When Mihai said we were running, he made it clear he was not alone. "We were together," he said. "They were shouting behind us." Sometimes he paused and added one word. Back. A single word describing a direction, a movement, a retreat. One evening, as his mother sat beside him, Mihai spoke in a very calm voice. "There was an order." His mother swallowed. "What order?" she asked. As Mihai answered, he closed his eyes. "Retreat." That phrase belonged to a soldier, not to a child. And in that moment, his mother understood. This was no longer just remembering. This was a shift of language. The words coming from Mihai's mouth did not belong to him, but they were coming out anyway. Because some memories return not through time, but through words. The specialist's office was designed for children. The walls were painted in light colors. Shelves held toys, and on the table lay pencils and sheets of paper. But when Mihai entered the room, he touched none of them. He stood silently for a moment, surveying the space, as if he were not measuring the room itself, but what had once happened there. The psychologist noticed and did not speak. That was the first rule. Questions would only come after the child spoke. Mihai sat at the table, picked up a pencil, waited for a moment, then lines began to appear on the paper. At first they were disordered, short strokes, marks without connection. But after a few minutes, the lines changed. They grew longer, more deliberate. Two elevations emerged, a narrow path between them. Beside the path, a fallen shape. The psychologist looked at the drawing, said nothing, only took notes, because this was not a child's imaginative sketch. This was a scene. The same thing happened in later sessions. No matter what Mihai was asked, the pencil always returned to the same place, the same two elevations, the same narrow path, the same empty space. Sometimes he added small dots along the path. Sometimes he shaded a dark area beside it. At the end of one session, the psychologist asked a very simple question. "Who is here?" Without lifting the pencil, Mihai answered, "Us." The question, "How many were there?" did not come. It didn't come because it was forbidden, but Mihai paused and added on his own, "Not many." The sentence carried a sense of loss. In another session, the psychologist placed several small figures on the table. No explanation was given. Mihai picked them up, placed some side by side, laid others flat on the surface. Then he positioned one figure slightly farther back. "That was me," he said, pointing to the figure lying on the table. "I was the last." This was not dramatization, it was placement. The psychologist's notes grew thicker, because the consistency continued. The same scene on different days, through different tools, but it never changed. At this point, the file moved beyond a single pair of hands. Other eyes were brought in, records were reviewed, drawings were placed side by side, and everyone noticed the same thing. These drawings were not random. No leading questions had been asked, yet the scene remained identical. For the specialists, this was a critical threshold, because a child's imagination does not remain fixed. But this scene did not shift. At the end of one session, Mihai grew tired. He set the pencil down on the table, leaned back in his chair. The psychologist opened his mouth to speak, but Mihai spoke first. "I shouldn't have drawn this," he said. His voice was not angry, not afraid. It sounded more like setting a boundary. "Why?" the psychologist asked. Mihai shrugged. "Because I remember." That sentence stopped everyone in the room, because remembering was no longer a possibility, it was a process, and that process was slowly returning. That day it was raining, but it was not a light drifting rain. It was the kind that weighed down the ground, that pulled at your feet. Mihai said it while standing by the window. He was looking into the garden, but what he saw was not grass. "It was like this," he said. "Everywhere was mud." His mother stood behind him. She didn't ask. She listened. "Our boots were always wet," Mihai continued. "We didn't take them off. If we did, we got cold." These were not a child's observations. They were a soldier's daily reality. "We slept very little," he said. "Those who slept took turns." He drew short lines on the floor with his finger, paused, then added, "No one slept deeply. You had to wake up." There was no fear in his voice, only routine. "Food," he said. He stopped for a moment. "There wasn't much. It was cold, but we didn't complain." His mother noticed something. As Mihai spoke, he didn't say "I." He said "we." He fell silent for a while. Then his voice lowered. "Some people prayed," he said, "not out loud." As he said this, he slightly lowered his head. "At night," he continued, "some made the sign of the cross, but no one watched." This was not the telling of a ritual. It was the description of a habit. "If we died," he said, "we knew there would be judgment." That word, judgment, did not belong to a child. Mihai paused, adjusted his breathing. "There were orders," he said. "Orders came first." A brief silence followed. "But inside," he added, "everyone thought the same thing." For the first time, his mother asked, "What did you think?" Mihai answered without hesitation. "That it would end," he said. "That we would survive." It was that simple. There was no heroism in that sentence, no ideology, only survival. "There were wounded," he continued. "We carried them." He lifted his shoulders slightly as if the weight were still there. "They didn't make a sound, because if you screamed, you gave away your position." That sentence changed the sound of the entire scene. Then came a moment. Mihai touched his chest. "There was someone," he said. "His name was Petru." He spoke the name calmly for the first time. "He was older than me," Mihai said. "He told me to run. I ran." His voice dropped slightly. "Then we stopped." His mother asked nothing. Mihai continued. "They said retreat," he said. "The truck stayed behind. It got stuck in the mud." This was no longer imagination. This was a lived moment. "We didn't shout to God," he said. "No one shouted." He paused. "We said it inside." Then he added, "Because if you shouted, someone else would hear you." This was the prayer of war. Silent, short, internal. Mihai fell silent. He didn't speak for a long time. Then in a very low voice he said, "That's how we lived there." And with that sentence, the door to the past was fully open. When the retreat began, no one thought of it as a decision. It felt more like necessity. As Mihai spoke, he placed his hands on his knees, as if he were still waiting. "It didn't happen all at once," he said. "Slowly." That word mattered, because it wasn't describing a flight. It was describing a dispersal. First, the sounds faded, he said. Then the shouting stopped. His mother realized something. Mihai was no longer describing the scene itself, but what came after. Some people left, he said. No one looked back. There was no harshness in the sentence, no judgment, only reality. We didn't get angry at those who left, he added, because everyone was thinking the same thing. His mother asked, "What were you thinking?" Mihai answered, "Living." The rain was still falling. The ground was heavy, feet lifted with effort. There were those who ran, he said, those who slowed down. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. He didn't say, "We left the wounded behind," but he did say, "There were some we couldn't carry." That meant leaving them behind. But he didn't use the word. At one point, they stopped. Mihai drew a dot on the floor, then added small lines around it. "We were here," he said. "Then we scattered." "How?" his mother asked. Mihai shrugged. "No one counted." That sentence marked the end of order. "Petru was next to me," he said. "Then he wasn't." This time the pause was longer. His mother didn't ask, "Did he shout?" Or, "Did you turn back?" Because Mihai was speaking on his own. "He said my name," Mihai said, "for the last time." There was no panic in the sentence, no dramatic emphasis, but it was the heaviest sentence of all. As the retreat continued, the sense of time disappeared. "We didn't know if it was night or day," he said. "The sky always looked the same." This was the state of constant alert. "We didn't want to sleep," he said. "If you slept..." The sentence remained unfinished, but its ending was clear. At one point, Mihai said this, "No one asked God for a miracle?" His mother flinched. "What did you ask for?" she asked. Mihai didn't think. "Not to be seen." That sentence summarized the entire philosophy of war. "Some people took something out of their pockets," he said. "Photographs." He paused. "They didn't look at them. They just carried them." That was hope of returning, silent, alone. Mihai slowed his narration. "Then our numbers dropped," he said. Talking stopped. His mother noticed something. Mihai was no longer saying we. He was saying I. The shift mattered. "I remained," he said. The sentence was short, final. There was silence for a while. Then Mihai added in a very low voice, "No one came back." There was no blame in that sentence. No resentment, only a conclusion. And that conclusion was pointing toward what came next. From that moment on, time began to move differently. As Mihai spoke, his words slowed, as if he moved too fast, something might happen again. "I wasn't running anymore," he said. "I couldn't run." He pressed his feet into the ground, leaned slightly over his knees. "The ground was pulling me," he said. Every step was heavier. This was not just exhaustion, it was the limit of the body. "My breathing," he said. He paused, then pressed his hand to his chest. It wasn't enough. His mother had heard that word before, but this time it was different. This time it wasn't a complaint. It was an observation. "I was breathing fast," he said. It didn't work. These were not the words of a child. They were the words of a body that had learned how to survive on breath. He said he heard a sound, but it wasn't shouting. "Like a whistle," he said. "Fast." His mother didn't ask, but Mihai added, "It passed." That word described something cutting through the air. Then he described the sensation of heat. "First it was warm," he said. "Very brief." That very brief lasted only a moment. "Then," he said, "cold." The difference between those two words was the body's signature of death. As Mihai said this, there was no fear on his face, only clarity. "I fell," he said. "My face hit the ground." He looked at the floor. for a long time. The smell of the earth, he said. Wet. That detail belonged not to the mind, but to the senses. They didn't ask if he prayed in that moment, but Mihai said it on his own. I said something, he said. My voice didn't come out. His mother swallowed. Inside, he added. This was the quietest prayer of war. Not long, not memorized, just a thought. No one came, he said. His tone didn't change. There was no bitterness, no surprise, as if he had already expected it. My eyes were open, he said, but I wasn't looking. This was the moment consciousness withdrew. My breath came in short bursts. As he said this, he took short, shallow breaths himself, then stopped. There was a long silence. His mother did not break it. Mihai lifted his head. There, he said, it didn't end. That sentence didn't say that death was not the end, but it said that something did not fully close. Then the sounds moved away, he said. There was no sky. This was time unraveling. One weight lifted, he said. He relaxed his shoulders. I wasn't cold anymore. That sentence marked the moment everything ended. Mihai fell silent. He didn't speak for a long time. Then, in a very low voice, he added, I stayed there. That sentence formed the heart of the story, because now all that remained was silence. There are moments that begin not with sound, but with silence. After what Mihai had told them, no one in the house spoke for a while. It was as if words had fulfilled their duty and stepped aside. Mihai had changed as well, but the change was not sudden. It happened slowly. First, he stopped wanting to talk. He no longer spoke unless asked, keeping what he remembered inside himself. Then the words began to fade. Sentences that had once been clear became shorter. Some remained unfinished. Some never came at all. When his mother noticed this, she felt relief for the first time, because Mihai's shoulders were no longer as tense. It was as if whatever he had been carrying was slowly being set down. The nights changed too. His sleep was still light, but he no longer woke up. He didn't sweat. His breathing didn't suddenly accelerate. Sometimes his mother would stand in the doorway, watching his face carefully. It looked calmer now. Whether that calm came from forgetting or from letting go was impossible to tell. The specialist sessions were reduced, then stopped entirely. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt the same thing. From this point on, pushing further would not be right. Remembering does not always heal. Sometimes remembering only keeps the wound open. One day, Mihai said a very simple sentence to his mother. It doesn't come anymore. She didn't ask what didn't come, because she already knew. For Dr. Whitman, a threshold had been crossed as well. The question was no longer, did this really happen? The real question was this: should a child carry something like this? In searching for answers, science must not harm the human being. And in this case, the point where science needed to stop was very clear. Mihai began to play like a child again. He lined up his toys once more. But this time, the arrangement was random. There were no rules, no lines, only play. As his mother watched him, a strange feeling rose inside her. It wasn't joy, but it wasn't fear either. It felt more like acceptance. One evening before going to bed, Mihai stopped and looked at his mother. "Mom," he said. She came to him immediately. "I'm here now." That sentence was like a door closing. And when the door closed, what remained behind it was silence. The research officially ended here. The file was closed. Interviews stopped. Notes were placed on the shelf. But some files, never truly close. For Dr. Whitman, the Mihai Popescu file was exactly that kind of case, because there was nothing unresolved. On the contrary, There was something painfully clear that could not be explained. Archival research lasted for months. Military records in Romania, unit reports, lists of the missing, especially the years 1944 to 1945, regions near the Carpathian passes, retreat lines. The pages were full, but some lines were empty. Units suffered heavy losses. Line collapsed. Contact lost during retreat. But there were no names, no faces. And that disturbed Whitman more than anything else, because what Mihai described pointed to the existence of a soldier. But that soldier did not exist in the official language of history. Perhaps he died before being recorded. Perhaps his name was never written down. Perhaps no one survived long enough to stop and write it. Whitman wrote this in the conclusion of his report. The issue in this case is not the absence of a match. It is the absence of the records that should exist. It was a scientific admission, and at the same time a boundary. Years passed. Mihai grew up. He started school, made friends. His life moved forward like everyone else's. When asked about his childhood, he didn't remember those days. There was no soldier, no mud, no one named Petru. Everything felt as if it had never happened. One day his mother asked one last time, "Sometimes, do you remember anything else?" Mihai shook his head. "No," he said, "nothing." Then he added, "But sometimes when it rains, the smell of the earth feels strange to me." That was all. Dr. Whitman later spoke about the case at a conference, without giving names, without naming places. The silence in the room was heavier than any question, and he ended his talk with this sentence: "Some stories do not emerge to be proven, but to be carried, and not everyone can carry them." This story did not offer proof, but it left a void. And perhaps the real question was this: if a life ends without ever entering the records of history, who is it really that has forgotten it?